What if everything you thought you knew about the monarchy, about the strength and resilience of the royals, was suddenly tested in a way you never expected? Princess Catherine, the very pillar holding the family's image intact, has made a shocking decision that could change the future of the monarchy forever. What happened behind closed doors to bring her to this breaking point? Stay with me, because this story is far from over. The responsibility for the Duchy of Cornwall had been mine for more than 5 decades, and though I had borne it through countless moments of pressure and expectation, nothing could have truly prepared me for the announcement that arrived on that cold December morning. Quiet in its wording, yet devastating in its weight, it changed everything. It was a moment I had known would come eventually, but never imagined I would witness. King Charles and Prince William had released an update regarding Princess Catherine, a subject the palace had long hoped would remain unspoken. In the space of a few breathless minutes, the nation would come to understand that something irreversible had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same. The moment arrived at exactly 7:08 a.m. on a bitterly cold December day, as winter finally claimed the city. A thick layer of frost blanketed the grounds of Kensington Palace, so heavy that it seemed as though winter itself had decided to descend on London overnight, covering the lawns in a glittering white veil. The sun, barely a presence at that hour, had just begun to rise, its light a pale, hesitant streak across the horizon, as if even dawn were reluctant to intrude on the stillness that hung so heavily over the royal household. It was the kind of morning where time seemed to slow, and the city beyond the palace walls stirred to life with a quiet, almost mournful grace. Buses hummed along their early routes, commuters bundled tightly against the cold, their scarves drawn high, faces obscured in the frost, and a thin mist lingered in the air, hanging low over the streets like a forgotten breath. But inside the palace, the stillness had already fractured, and the weight of what was to come pressed down on the very air we breathed. At 7:04 a.m., an alert moved swiftly through the communications wing, a briefing sheet, simple and white, with only the royal crest embossed at the top. It was stark, unadorned, and moved with unusual speed through the corridors of the palace. There were no colored markers, no coded phrasing to obscure its meaning, nothing to cushion the blow. Just the cold clarity of the words printed across the page. Joint statement from His Majesty the King and the Prince of Wales regarding the Princess of Wales. It circulated quickly, far too quickly, and as it passed from hand to hand, a hush seemed to settle over the staff. The kind of silence that fills the air when you know something monumental is unfolding, something that cannot be undone. Staff members, usually so composed in the face of the many updates they processed, froze in mid-step. You could feel it, the subtle shift, the sudden rupture in the air that made everything feel different. This was not just another announcement. This was something far more profound. Royal updates, after all, came often enough. Engagements, schedules, patronages, these were daily matters that the palace staff handled with quiet efficiency. But there is a particular kind of gravity to the language of the palace when something irreversible has taken place, when the weight of history presses in, and everyone in the room knows it, whether they dare speak it aloud or not. This was one of those moments. Everyone recognized it immediately. The air around us thickened, and for a brief, timeless moment, all eyes were drawn to that single heading on the page, as if it held the answer to everything that had come before and everything that would follow. At 7:08 a.m., the statement went live. It was brief, too brief. It was the kind of brevity that carried an immense weight, a few short lines that conveyed more than any lengthy speech could. In light of sustained and increasing pressures surrounding the Princess of Wales's public role, and with deep consideration for her long-term responsibilities, His Majesty the King and the Prince of Wales have agreed that the Princess will step back indefinitely from all public engagements. There were no embellishments, no softening of the message, no mention of when or if she might return, just the stark finality of the word indefinitely, a word that left no room for ambiguity. It was not just a break, it was a retreat, a decision made with the knowledge that something had changed forever. The weight of the words was palpable, and as they settled over the room, everyone in the palace knew this was not just another royal update. This was a turning point. In the seconds that followed, phones buzzed across the country, one by one, each vibrating with the same message. BBC presenters blinked in stunned silence. Sky News anchors, usually poised, pressed their earpieces harder into their ears, trying to gather more context. Radio hosts in Manchester and Bristol scrambled to confirm the wording, their voices faltering with the shock they felt. In Edinburgh, a woman standing at her bus stop whispered, "Dear God, they've actually said it." In Cardiff, a retired teacher leaned over to her husband, murmuring, "This can't be temporary. It can't be." In Belfast, a shopkeeper shook his head slowly, muttering, "If they're announcing it like this, something's been building." It wasn't the kind of news that arrived with sirens or spectacle. No, sometimes tragedy comes in the form of a single, weighty paragraph delivered quietly at dawn. No fanfare, no dramatics, just the kind of finality that leaves the public grasping for explanations, even as the palace withholds them. Across the Atlantic, the impact was felt just as swiftly. On CNN, an anchor paused mid-sentence, her eyes widening in disbelief as the statement appeared on her screen. On CBS, a commentator exhaled deeply, calling the moment unprecedented. MSNBC fell into stunned silence. The news was seismic, and yet no one felt its weight more acutely than those within the royal household. At Clarence House, Charles sat in his private study, the early morning light casting long shadows across the carpet. He had known this day was coming. He had signed the statement himself the night before, but knowing it would come and feeling it unfold were two very different things. As he held the printed page in his hands, he felt not only the weight of the crown, but the ache of a father who never wanted this moment to arrive. At Windsor, William stood by his office window, staring out at the frost crystallizing on the glass. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The statement had been prepared with his full involvement. He had insisted on clarity, dignity, and truth. Yet as he watched it go live, watching the words ripple across screens and airwaves, it felt like witnessing a line he never wished to draw being carved in stone. For years, he had fiercely protected Catherine. He had absorbed the pressure, the criticism, the speculation, and the global scrutiny that came with being her protector. But there comes a time when even the most steadfast protection requires surrendering the illusion of control. And this statement, this was that moment. Inside the palace, whispers spread quickly. It wasn't just a pause. This felt final. No one could phrase it like that unless something had truly broken. William must be devastated, they murmured. But it wasn't devastation. Not exactly, it was resolve. A quiet, ironclad resolve layered over heartbreak. The kind that settles into a person when they know they have done what was necessary, even though it costs them deeply. Catherine had been the monarchy's steadying force for years, an anchor in the storm, the embodiment of duty without spectacle. Her grace, often unspoken, had kept the institution steady through its most turbulent seasons. But the weight she had carried had grown too great, too relentless, too consuming. And this decision, it was not the result of one single event or a sudden fracture. It was the inevitable recognition that the burden had become too much to bear, and Catherine had reached the breaking point. By 7:15 a.m., the gates of the palace were surrounded by a small crowd. By 7:23, radio callers were choking back their tears. By 7:30, international headlines framed the moment as a turning point for the monarchy. The realization spread across Britain like a cold, unrelenting frost. Princess Catherine, the anchor, the symbol, the quiet strength, was stepping away from the world she had upheld with such unwavering devotion. And for the first time in decades, the monarchy appeared fragile. Royal updates came often, engagements, schedules, patronages. These were the everyday matters of palace life, routine announcements that flowed with the natural rhythm of the monarchy. But this was different. This announcement carried a weight, a gravity that even the most seasoned aides, those who had weathered countless royal statements, couldn't ignore. There is a particular kind of gravity in the language of the palace when something irreversible has occurred, something that cannot be undone no matter how much time passes or how many words are spoken. And in that moment, everyone in the palace knew it. There was no mistaking it. At 7:08 a.m., the statement went live. It was brief, too brief. And it was this very brevity that made it so devastating. It was a few short lines that seemed to distill a lifetime of unspoken truths into something uncomfortably clear. In light of sustained and increasing pressures surrounding the Princess of Wales's public role, and with deep consideration for her long-term responsibilities, His Majesty the King and the Prince of Wales have agreed that the Princess will step back indefinitely from all public engagements. No elaboration. No comfort, no hint of a return. Just the stark finality of the word indefinitely, a word that left no room for doubt or ambiguity. It was the kind of declaration that could not be softened by gentle phrases or reassurances. It was written with the unflinching clarity of two men who fully understood the far-reaching impact their words would have. The weight of it settled over the nation in an instant. Within minutes, phones across the country buzzed into life. The quiet hum of the morning was shattered. BBC presenters blinked in stunned silence, struggling to process what they had just read. Sky News anchors pressed their earpieces into their heads, searching for answers, scrambling for any additional context, as if the words themselves weren't enough. Radio hosts in Manchester and Bristol fumbled with their scripts, desperately trying to confirm the statement before reading it aloud, their voices thick with the shock they could not hide. In Edinburgh, a woman on her morning bus stopped mid-step, her face pale as she whispered to herself, "Dear God, they've actually said it." In Cardiff, a retired teacher leaned in toward her husband, her voice low, barely above a whisper, "This can't be temporary, it can't be." In Belfast, a shopkeeper shook his head slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he muttered, "If they're saying it like this, something's been building." This was no ordinary announcement. It wasn't the kind of news that arrived with sirens or flashbulbs. No, sometimes the most devastating moments arrive quietly, slipping into the world with the kind of finality that leaves the public scrambling for explanations that, for now, the palace would not provide. Across the country, the message spread like wildfire. The truth was out, and the world was left to absorb it piece by piece. The announcement arrived without the expected fanfare or spectacle. There were no grand orchestrations, no preemptive warnings. Sometimes tragedy arrives quietly, like a single sharp sentence delivered at dawn, carrying the kind of finality that leaves the public grasping for explanations the palace will never provide. It wasn't a crisis accompanied by flashing lights or sirens. No, this was a quiet unraveling, a moment that would change everything, and yet it passed in the most unassuming way, as if the world could absorb it all with little more than a collective breath. The reaction was immediate. On CNN, the anchor's voice faltered, eyes widening as the statement appeared on screen, the words so heavy that they seemed to steal the air from the room. On CBS, a commentator exhaled sharply, the sound of it filling the silence as he called the moment unprecedented, a rare acknowledgement of just how deeply this moment would be felt in royal history. MSNBC, known for its rapid-fire analysis, fell into a stunned silence, the kind of quiet that overtakes a room when speculation no longer feels appropriate, when the magnitude of the truth is simply too overwhelming to frame in words. No one could fully grasp the magnitude of what had just occurred, not until they had time to process, to reflect, and to witness the ripple effect that would follow. But no one felt the weight of this moment more profoundly than those within the royal households themselves, those closest to the heart of the monarchy, who had watched the burden grow too heavy to bear for far too long. At Clarence House, King Charles sat alone in his private study, the early morning light spilling through the window, casting long, deep shadows across the plush carpet. The room, usually filled with quiet activity and the soft hum of palace life, felt eerily still. He had known this day was coming. He had prepared himself, signed the statement himself the night before, each word heavy with the awareness of its consequence. But knowing something is inevitable and feeling the weight of it are two entirely different things. As he held the printed page, the reality of it settled over him. The crown he had worn for years, heavy with responsibility, now felt even more burdensome in his hands. And beyond the weight of the monarchy, there was the weight of his heart, the ache of a father, one who had never wanted this moment to arrive, never wanted to see his family face this kind of public reckoning. The silence in the room pressed in around him, and for a moment, even the responsibilities of the crown seemed distant, as if they too understood the enormity of what had just transpired. There was no escape from this moment, no turning back from the irrevocable shift that had been set in motion. And as Charles sat in his study, holding the paper that had altered the course of everything, the full force of the decision hit him, not just as the king, but as a father, a man who had never wished to carry this burden. At Windsor, Prince William stood motionless by the window of his private office, his eyes fixed on the frost that had crystallized along the glass, creating delicate patterns that mirrored the heaviness in his chest. He did not speak. He did not move. The quiet hum of the palace seemed distant, swallowed by the weight of the moment. The statement had been prepared with his full involvement, shaped by his insistence on clarity, dignity, and truth. Every word had been meticulously chosen, every sentence considered with care. Yet as he watched it go live, watched those carefully crafted words ripple across screens and airwaves, he felt an undeniable shift, as if the world itself had come to a halt. It felt like witnessing a line he had never wished to draw, a line carved in stone, irreversible, unyielding. And in that moment, he knew the monarchy was irrevocably altered. For years, he had fiercely protected Catherine, shielding her from the relentless pressure of the media, the unending criticism, the constant speculation, and the invasive global scrutiny. He had absorbed it all, shouldered the weight of the monarchy's expectations, and deflected the harshest blows. But now there comes a time when protection requires surrendering the illusion of control. There comes a moment when shielding someone means stepping back and allowing them the space to breathe, to live outside the suffocating expectations that the world imposes on them. And this statement, this was that moment. It was the hard, painful truth that no amount of defense could prevent, and it was his responsibility, however heartbreaking, to accept it. Inside the palace, whispers began to spread like wildfire, their urgency palpable. This wasn't just a temporary pause, this felt final. The palace would not phrase it this way unless something truly significant, something irrevocable had occurred. William's name echoed in every whispered conversation. William must be devastated, they murmured. And yet it wasn't devastation that filled his heart, not exactly. It was resolve, a kind of quiet, unspoken determination layered over heartbreak. The type of resolve that settles in when you know you've done what was necessary, even though every instinct within you aches with the cost of it. The kind of heartbreak that doesn't come from the loss itself, but from the recognition that loss was inevitable and that no matter how deeply it cuts, it was the only choice left. Catherine had been the steadying force of the monarchy for so many years. The quiet strength at its core, the embodiment of duty without spectacle. She had been the constant presence, the one who held everything together even when the world was fraying at the edges. Her grace, though often unseen, had served as the foundation upon which the monarchy had relied during its most turbulent moments. But the weight she had carried had grown too great, too relentless, too consuming. What had once been manageable, her role, her public image, the expectations placed upon her, had become a burden far beyond what any one person could endure. And the announcement, it wasn't the result of one sudden event, nor a dramatic fracture. No, it was the inevitable recognition that the burden she had been carrying for so long had finally reached a point where it was too much to bear. By 7:15 a.m., the gates of the palace had drawn a small, anxious crowd. By 7:23, radio callers were struggling to hold back their emotions, their voices thick with disbelief. By 7:30, international headlines framed the moment as a monumental turning point for the monarchy. It was a stark, unspoken truth that spread across Britain like the frost itself. Princess Catherine, the anchor, the symbol of strength, the quiet force who had upheld the monarchy with such unwavering devotion, was stepping away from the world she had carried on her shoulders for so long. And for the first time in decades, the monarchy itself appeared fragile, as though a quiet shift had fractured something once thought unbreakable. To truly understand why the announcement at 7:08 a.m. carried such devastating weight, we must first look back at the weeks that led up to it. Weeks that passed with subtle, almost imperceptible signs, like cracks forming beneath the surface of winter ice, that only those who had lived long within the royal structure could recognize. At first, they were so faint that they might have been easily overlooked, but to those who were close enough to see, they were unmistakable. It all began in mid-November, when the palace quietly released an updated list of engagements, an innocuous change on the surface, but one that immediately caught the attention of those who watched the rhythm of royal duties with careful eyes. Several appearances that Catherine had long been expected to attend were suddenly absent. There was no explanation, no mention of the reason for the change, only a polite line about schedule adjustments, the kind of phrasing the palace often uses when it hopes the public won't press for further details. But inside the palace, among the aides who had witnessed Catherine's steady devotion for over a decade, concern began to stir. It was subtle at first, but it was there, lingering in the quiet spaces between scheduled events. Catherine had always been the picture of reliability, punctual, poised, elegantly present, even on the heaviest of days. She was a constant presence, an unwavering pillar in the storm of royal life. But now something had shifted. She seemed to be quietly slipping into the background. William noticed it first, as he always did. He had always been attuned to the smallest changes in Catherine, whether in her actions or her demeanor. Evenings when she retreated earlier than usual, perhaps needing rest, but the kind of rest that felt different, deeper. Mornings when her schedule began later, a subtle withdrawal from the pace she had kept so effortlessly before. And in the moments between duties, those rare pauses in her day, she seemed to drift into a silence that felt far deeper than simple fatigue. He asked gently, at first, whether she wanted to slow her pace, to take a moment to rest, perhaps to reset. But Catherine, ever conditioned by years of royal discipline, brushed aside his concern with her usual grace, masking the weariness that was now etched in her eyes. She reassured him, as she always did, that everything was fine. But despite her assurances, the truth lingered in the spaces between her words, in the silence that followed her every movement. The truth was that the demands on her time had grown exponentially over the years. Each engagement, each public appearance, each meeting and royal visit required preparation, diplomacy, composure, and emotional steadiness. And that was just the public face of it. Beyond the spotlight, there were the endless charitable initiatives, the private briefings, the careful coordination of royal duties, and the constant, ever-present political sensitivity of her role. She was not merely a figurehead. She was the living embodiment of modern royalty, expected to balance the weight of public scrutiny with the unspoken expectation of perfection. What the public rarely saw was the toll this took on her. There were no cameras in the private rooms where she reviewed documents late into the night, no photographers capturing the long hours spent behind closed doors, the endless demands placed on her shoulders. And yet, the pressure never stopped. It followed her into her quiet moments at home, seeping into her personal time, blurring the lines between duty and self. Catherine had been a steadying force for the monarchy for so long, her grace and composure becoming the foundation on which the institution rested. But that foundation had been slowly eroding beneath the weight of expectations too heavy to bear for much longer. It was a pressure that had started to carve its mark, slowly but surely. By late November, internal reports began circulating that described Catherine's workload as unsustainable in the long term. The toll it was taking was becoming increasingly evident. One senior aide wrote bluntly, "We are leaning too heavily on the princess's presence. If the strain continues, the system will bend around her absence rather than her involvement." Charles read that line twice. The words were simple, yet they carried an undeniable truth. As king, he had watched the monarchy weather scandals, political storms, and shifting generational expectations, but this was different. Catherine's role had become far more than symbolic. She was the quiet anchor, the steadying force behind the crown's image during turbulent times. She was the one who held it all together, whether anyone saw it or not. And the thought of losing that presence, even if only temporarily, made Charles realize just how fragile their stability had become. What had once been an unshakable foundation now seemed perilously close to crumbling. Then, the pressure from abroad began to build. American media outlets, ever hungry for royal drama, increased their coverage of royal dynamics, with a particular focus on Catherine. Recycled narratives, unfounded claims, and speculative commentary flooded the airwaves, often blurring the lines between fact and fiction. Digital analysts inside the palace took note of a disturbing trend: spikes in misinformation about Catherine, often emerging in the hours following major royal engagements, turning her every move into fodder for the tabloids. William received nightly digital briefings that showed how the media's appetite for scandal had become insatiable. The monarchy was entering a season where public patience was thinning, and any misstep, real or imagined, could eclipse months of careful royal work. The pressure on Catherine, graceful and composed as she had always been, was mounting. She was bearing the brunt of it, and William, though fiercely protective, could feel the strain on her. It was a burden no one had anticipated she would carry for so long, and now it was becoming unbearable. Meanwhile, her private secretary began to subtly adjust Catherine's schedule again, removing evening engagements, reducing her involvement in events she had once championed with great passion. Each adjustment came with an apology, a whispered reassurance from staff, but Catherine never expressed frustration. She didn't complain. If anything, she seemed relieved, which unsettled those around her. Relief in the palace had become a rare and unfamiliar sensation. It was a sign, though subtle, that something had changed. By the final week of November, the quiet alarms had become undeniable. Catherine's staff had noticed the small but telling changes, how she paused longer before stepping into public engagements, how her smile, once so easy, had become a little slower to appear. Her posture remained elegant, but there was something shadowed about her now, something unspoken that weighed on her shoulders. William, ever watchful, hovered near her during these moments, his concern growing with each passing day. He didn't ask if she needed support. He didn't need to. The tension in the air was clear. She needed more than he could give, more than the palace could offer. The clearest sign came when Catherine quietly declined a scheduled planning session for a major spring initiative, a meeting she had once eagerly anticipated, one she had helped shape with passion and dedication. When the reminder came, she simply said, "Not today, please." The words were gentle, small in their simplicity, but they resonated like a bell in the quiet of the palace, a quiet bell that echoed throughout the royal household, marking a moment of change, a moment of finality. By the last week of November, it was clear to everyone. Something was out of balance. Something had shifted, and no amount of adjustments to schedules or public narratives would make it right again. Catherine was reaching her limit. She had been carrying the weight of the monarchy for so long, and now neither William nor anyone else could ignore it any longer. The pressure was too much. It was breaking her, piece by piece, the breaking point. Didn't arrive with loud arguments or dramatic declarations. It wasn't a public outburst or a scandalous revelation. No, it emerged in the quiet spaces between carefully chosen words, in rooms where the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to be said. It began on a dim afternoon in late November, when the winter light softened into a dull pewter haze, blurring the edges of the palace corridors and making everything seem distant, uncertain. The senior royals gathered in the 1844 room at Buckingham Palace, a space that had witnessed generations of royal decisions, crises, and reconciliations. The room had seen history unfold, but today it would see a different kind of reckoning. The meeting had been called by Charles himself, after reviewing yet another internal report detailing the intensifying pressures surrounding Catherine's public role. The tone of the report was clear. Something had to change, and quickly. William arrived first. He stood near the tall windows, his hands lightly clasped behind his back, staring out at the courtyard where the last leaves of autumn clung stubbornly to their branches. He looked composed, as he always did, but the stillness around him felt heavier than usual, as though he were holding something inside himself that he feared might break free if he spoke. Anne entered next, her calm, resolute expression unchanged by the years of royal storms she had weathered. She glanced at William, and in that instant she understood. This was not a logistical meeting. It was something much deeper, something personal, something that, if they were to move forward, would change them all. Camilla entered moments later, her presence steady, but filled with the quiet understanding of someone who had witnessed such crises before. She had seen the weight of responsibility settle on the shoulders of those who had borne it before. She knew what was coming, and yet it didn't make the reality any easier to face. When Charles entered, the room shifted. His movements were slow, deliberate, not from frailty, but from the weight of the responsibility pressing on him from all sides. The throne, the family, the public, every decision seemed to carry the weight of history, but today it was more personal. Today, the unmistakable truth was that Catherine, the woman who had upheld so much of the monarchy's image, the woman who had borne its heaviest burdens, was struggling beneath an invisible weight that none of them had fully acknowledged until now. The air in the room grew heavier with each passing second. The private secretary opened the meeting with a thick folder in hand, its contents heavy with reports and analysis that had been compiled over weeks of mounting pressure. The first page alone seemed to suffocate the air in the room, its starkness cutting through any pretense of normalcy. A graph dominated the page, relentless, unforgiving, detailing the global scrutiny targeting Catherine over the past months. The pressure, once a subtle whisper, had become a deafening roar, growing louder, faster, impossible to ignore. It was accelerating, and everyone in the room could feel it. William's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible shift that was the only outward sign of the storm brewing inside him. His eyes, once calm and measured, now carried a flicker of something darker, something deeper. He clenched his fists at his sides, not in anger, but in a quiet fury that only those closest to him could understand. Anne leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on the next section of the report. She took the folder from the secretary and flipped through it with the precision of someone who had seen enough crises to know when one was about to consume them all. It listed the postponed engagements, the quiet withdrawals from events that Catherine had once been so committed to, each omission another thread, pulling away from the fabric of her once unshakable role. Anne set the paper down slowly, as if the weight of its contents was more than she could bear. She exhaled, her breath controlled but heavy, the weight of years of royal responsibility in every exhale. "If we continue at this pace," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with something unspoken, "we risk losing her from public life entirely." The room fell silent. Anne had never been one for dramatic phrasing. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were always measured, always real. She had lived through the storms, seen the twists and turns of royal duty, and the toll it took on even the most stalwart figures. But now her words seemed to echo, filling the room with an undeniable truth. Camilla reached for the folder next, her movements deliberate and slow. Her voice, when it came, was steady but soft, a voice that had carried the weight of difficult truths for years. "The pressure on Catherine is not like what we faced 20 years ago. It is ferocious. It is constant. It is global. We must act now before it consumes her completely." Her words were like a final breath before the storm, a warning that no one could ignore, even if they wanted to. The silence stretched long after she spoke, heavy and thick, as if the room itself was waiting for Charles to respond. His voice finally broke through the tension, low and filled with an almost painful weariness. "What are our options?" he asked, the words carrying the weight of a man grappling with a truth he never wanted to confront. This was not the voice of a king commanding his family. This was the voice of a father, someone who had seen the strains of duty and sacrifice all his life, but never expected to feel it so personally. The private secretary, his own expression grim, outlined the options with practiced efficiency, but there was a sense of finality in his words that could not be ignored. The first option was to increase communication around Catherine's schedule shifts, perhaps issuing a statement to explain her absence more fully, but that would only risk further speculation, opening the door for the media to fill in the blanks with their own narratives. The second was to quietly reduce her workload, scale back her duties, but the public had already noticed the subtle changes. Too many times had the palace hoped the public wouldn't notice the quiet adjustments. That door had already closed. The third option, the one no one wanted to speak aloud, hung in the air like a suffocating presence. A formal, public acknowledgement that Catherine needed an indefinite break from royal duties, a decision that would be as devastating as it was necessary. No one wanted to say it, but it was the truth they were all avoiding. It was the only option that had the potential to save Catherine from herself, but it would come with a cost, so great it would shake the monarchy to its core. If you found this story as gripping as we did, make sure to like, share, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. You don't want to miss what happens next in this royal saga.